Imagine this. You are Rafael del Riego, a Spanish general standing in a makeshift courtroom in Madrid in the year 1823. Your wrists burn from the iron shackles as you look into the cold eyes of the man you once called your rightful king. Ferdinand VII sits before you, his bloated face twisted into a smirk of satisfaction. This is the same monarch you risked everything to restore to power, the man you fought Napoleon's armies to defend, the ruler you believed would bring freedom and justice to Spain. The betrayal cuts deeper than any blade. You led the revolution that forced him to accept the Constitution of 1812, the document that promised equality and human rights to every Spaniard. But now, with French bayonets at his back, Ferdinand has torn that constitution to shreds and condemned you to death for the crime of believing in democracy. In hours, you will hang from a rope in the Plaza de la Quebrada, while this monster watches from his palace window, probably touching himself with excitement at your suffering. What you don't realize as you stand there facing your execution is that this king harbors secrets so twisted, so physically repulsive, that they will reshape the entire future of the Spanish Empire. Ferdinand VII isn't just politically perverted. He's anatomically cursed in ways that make modern medical anomalies seem quaint by comparison. His body carries deformities so extreme that 4 different wives will flee in terror from his marriage bed, and the fate of nations will hang on whether doctors can design devices to contain his monstrous anatomy. This isn't just the story of Spain's worst king. This is the story of how one man's physical freakishness and moral depravity destroyed an empire and plunged Europe into decades of civil war. You're about to discover that Ferdinand VII was both literally and figuratively the biggest dick in European history, and the consequences of his perversions are still echoing through Spain today. Before we descend into the darkest recesses of royal degeneracy, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths that shaped our world, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. These buried stories of power, betrayal, and shocking anatomical secrets need to be told, and there are countless more waiting in history's most forbidden archives. Your support helps preserve these testimonies to human depravity and resilience. Ferdinand VII entered this world on October 14, 1784, already carrying the genetic poison that had fermented in Spanish royal bloodlines for generations. Born in the shadow of El Escorial, that massive monument to Habsburg power, he was heir to a throne built on centuries of systematic inbreeding. His parents, Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, were themselves the products of cousin marriages that had produced a royal family tree with all the genetic diversity of a thumbprint. But Ferdinand's true corruption began not in his DNA, but in his upbringing. While his parents placed their complete trust in Manuel Godoy, a handsome young guardsman who had become the Queen's lover and possibly Ferdinand's real father, the future king learned that betrayal was not just acceptable, but profitable. Godoy wielded absolute power over Spain, while the actual king remained oblivious to his wife's very public affair. Ferdinand watched this dynamic and absorbed a crucial lesson. Power belonged to whoever was willing to be the most ruthless, the most deceptive, the most morally flexible. By age 16, Ferdinand had already begun conspiring against his own father. His tutor, Father Felipe Riaza, encouraged the young prince's resentment and jealousy, urging him to reach out to Napoleon Bonaparte for support against his parents' government. This wasn't typical adolescent rebellion. This was treason orchestrated by a teenager who had learned that family bonds meant nothing when power was at stake. Ferdinand was writing secret letters to France's emperor, offering to betray Spain's interests in exchange for Napoleon's backing in a coup against his own father. The conspiracy exploded into the open during the tumult of Aranjuez in March 1808. A mob of Ferdinand's supporters attacked Godoy's palace, nearly killing the minister and forcing Charles IV to abdicate in favor of his son. Ferdinand had successfully orchestrated the overthrow of his own father through violence and intimidation. But his triumph lasted exactly 47 days. Napoleon had been playing Ferdinand like a violin. The French emperor summoned the new Spanish king to Bayonne under the pretense of recognizing his legitimacy. Instead, Napoleon forced both Ferdinand and his father to renounce their claims to the Spanish throne, handing the crown to his brother Joseph Bonaparte. Ferdinand, faced with French military might, collapsed immediately. Not only did he abdicate without resistance, he actively collaborated with the enemy, writing fawning letters to Napoleon congratulating him on his victories over Spanish forces and begging to be adopted as one of the emperor's surrogate sons. While Spanish guerrillas died fighting the French occupation in Ferdinand's name, the so-called rightful king was living comfortably in the Château de Valençay, enjoying French hospitality and publicly supporting the regime that had enslaved his country. For 6 years, Ferdinand VII played the perfect prisoner, never once attempting escape or resistance, content to let others die for a throne he had already voluntarily surrendered. The historical record of Ferdinand's collaboration is damning. Letters preserved in French archives show him celebrating French military victories over Spanish resistance fighters. He congratulated Napoleon on the siege of Zaragoza, where tens of thousands of Spanish civilians died defending their city. He praised the emperor's tactics during the brutal suppression of the Madrid uprising, where French soldiers executed hundreds of Spanish patriots in the streets. When Spanish delegates traveled to Valençay to negotiate his restoration, Ferdinand initially refused to return unless Napoleon personally guaranteed his safety. He had grown comfortable with his gilded imprisonment and was terrified of facing the Spanish people he had abandoned. Only when Napoleon's empire began collapsing did Ferdinand finally agree to reclaim his throne, and even then he tried to negotiate terms that would protect his French collaborators from retribution. But Ferdinand's moral cowardice was only the beginning of his perversions. His physical anatomy harbored secrets that would prove equally destructive to Spain's future. From the moment he reached sexual maturity, it became clear that Ferdinand VII was endowed with male anatomy so grotesquely oversized and malformed that it would terrorize 4 successive wives and nearly prevent the continuation of the Bourbon dynasty. Contemporary accounts describe Ferdinand's genitalia in terms that sound like medical horror stories. A French diplomat who had occasion to observe the king's anatomy wrote that his member was thin as a stick of sealing wax at its base, thick as a fist at its extremity, and as long as a billiard cue. This wasn't poetic exaggeration, it was clinical documentation of a deformity so extreme that it made normal sexual intercourse impossible. The king's anatomy was not just oversized, but grotesquely misshapen. Spanish court physicians documented a condition that modern medicine would classify as severe macrophallus, combined with structural abnormalities that prevented proper function. The base was unnaturally narrow, while the extremity swelled to impossible proportions, creating a shape that could not achieve full penetration without causing severe trauma to his partners. This physical deformity became a matter of state importance when Ferdinand's inability to consummate his marriages threatened the royal succession. Spanish court records, preserved in the royal archives, contain detailed medical consultations about the king's condition and the devices that physicians designed to enable sexual intercourse. Custom cushions, restraining apparatus, and specialized positioning equipment were created to allow the king to attempt intimate relations with his wives. Ferdinand's first wife, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, was 18 when she married him in 1802. Their marriage contract included the standard provisions for royal unions, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of her wedding night. Letters to her mother, preserved in the Neapolitan State Archives, reveal her horror and despair at discovering her husband's deformity and his complete lack of empathy for her suffering. Maria Antonia wrote that Ferdinand showed no concern for her pain during their attempted intimacies, treating her body as an obstacle to be overcome rather than considering her comfort or well-being. She described nights of agony as Ferdinand and his physicians experimented with devices and positions designed to make penetration possible. The psychological trauma was as severe as the physical damage, as Maria Antonia realized she had been traded to a monster who viewed her purely as a vessel for producing heirs. The young queen's health deteriorated rapidly under the strain of Ferdinand's sexual demands. Court physicians documented internal injuries that required constant medical attention. Maria Antonia developed infections and scarring that made any intimate contact excruciating, but Ferdinand continued to demand his conjugal rights regardless of her suffering. She endured 2 pregnancies that ended in miscarriages, possibly due to the physical trauma of conception attempts. By 1805, Maria Antonia was living in constant fear of her husband's sexual advances. She had developed what modern psychology would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing panic attacks whenever Ferdinand approached her chambers. Court ladies reported that she would hide in closets and sob for hours after being summoned to perform her wifely duties. The Queen's death in 1806 at age 21 was officially attributed to tuberculosis, but private correspondence between court physicians suggests that her decline was hastened by the physical and psychological trauma of her marriage. One doctor wrote that Maria Antonia died of a broken spirit as much as any disease, her will to live destroyed by years of sexual torture disguised as royal duty. Ferdinand's reaction to his wife's death revealed the depths of his narcissism and emotional void. Rather than showing grief or remorse, he immediately began planning his next marriage, viewing Maria Antonia's death as merely an inconvenience that had temporarily interrupted his quest for an heir. He showed no awareness that his own behavior might have contributed to her suffering and death. But Ferdinand's sexual problems were compounded by his complete inability to form emotional connections with other human beings. Court observers noted that he treated everyone around him, including his wives, as objects to be manipulated for his pleasure or convenience. He lacked any capacity for empathy or genuine affection, viewing relationships purely in terms of power dynamics and personal advantage. The king's servants reported that Ferdinand took pleasure in the fear he inspired in others. He would deliberately summon his wives at inappropriate hours, knowing they dreaded his presence, and seemed to enjoy their visible terror when he entered their chambers. His sexual demands weren't just about physical gratification, but about asserting dominance and causing psychological pain. Ferdinand's second marriage in 1816 to his niece, Maria Isabel of Portugal, continued the pattern of sexual trauma and marital horror. Isabel was only 19 when she became queen, and, like her predecessor, she was completely unprepared for the reality of being married to a man whose anatomy made normal intimacy impossible. The age difference between Ferdinand and Isabel was significant, but more disturbing was the family relationship, as Isabel was marrying her maternal uncle. Portuguese court records reveal that Isabel's family had been informed about Ferdinand's physical condition before the marriage negotiations were finalized. However, the political alliance between Spain and Portugal was considered more important than Isabel's personal well-being, and her parents essentially sold her into sexual slavery disguised as royal marriage. Isabel's wedding night was documented in shocking detail by her lady-in-waiting, who recorded the young queen's screams echoing through the palace corridors. The custom cushions and restraining devices had been improved since Ferdinand's first marriage, but they still could not compensate for the fundamental incompatibility between his anatomy and normal human sexuality. Isabel suffered severe internal injuries that required immediate medical attention. The psychological impact on Isabel was devastating. Letters to her sister in Lisbon described nightmares, depression, and a complete loss of appetite that left her constantly weak and sickly. She wrote that she felt like a prisoner in her own body, never knowing when Ferdinand would summon her for another session of what she called the torture. Ferdinand's demands on Isabel were particularly cruel because he had become obsessed with producing a male heir. Each failed pregnancy attempt was followed by renewed and more violent efforts at conception. Court physicians designed increasingly elaborate apparatus to facilitate penetration, treating Isabel's body like a mechanical problem to be solved rather than considering her humanity. Isabel managed to conceive twice during their brief marriage, but both pregnancies ended tragically. The first resulted in a daughter who lived only 5 months, possibly due to birth defects caused by the trauma of conception or the genetic consequences of the incestuous union. The second pregnancy ended in stillbirth, with court records suggesting that Isabel's internal injuries had made carrying a child to term nearly impossible. The circumstances of Isabel's death in 1818 remain disturbing even by the standards of Ferdinand's other marriages. She died during what was supposed to be a routine medical examination, but eyewitness accounts suggest that Ferdinand had demanded the physicians perform invasive procedures to determine why she was not conceiving more successfully. Isabel was conscious and screaming when the doctors began their examination, but they proceeded anyway, believing she was merely hysterical. Court records indicate that Isabel bled to death on the examination table while Ferdinand watched from across the room, showing no emotion as his second wife died in agony. Some historians suggest that Isabel's death was actually a botched abortion attempt, as Ferdinand may have demanded the termination of a pregnancy that was not developing as he wished. Ferdinand's reaction to Isabel's death was even more callous than his response to Maria Antonia's passing. He was reportedly annoyed by the inconvenience of her death, complaining to his ministers that he would now have to find another wife and start the heir production process over again. He showed no grief or remorse, viewing Isabel as a defective piece of equipment that had failed to perform its function. Within months of Isabel's death, Ferdinand had already begun negotiations for his third marriage. His approach to finding wives had become purely transactional, with his ministers instructed to evaluate potential brides based on their health, fertility, and ability to withstand the physical demands of marriage to a man with Ferdinand's anatomical peculiarities. The pattern of sexual terror and marital horror reached its peak with Ferdinand's third wife, Princess Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, whom he married in 1819. Josepha was only 16 when she became queen, making her the youngest of Ferdinand's wives and arguably the most vulnerable to his predatory behavior. The Saxon court had been informed about Ferdinand's reputation, but the political advantages of the marriage were considered worth the sacrifice of another young woman's well-being. Josepha was described by contemporaries as unusually beautiful and innocent, qualities that seemed to particularly attract Ferdinand's attention. Court observers noted that he took special pleasure in corrupting innocents, and Josepha's youth and naivety made her an ideal target for his psychological manipulation. From their first meeting, Ferdinand began grooming Josepha for the sexual ordeal that awaited her. The wedding night with Josepha was particularly brutal because Ferdinand had grown impatient with the slow progress of his heir production efforts. Court physicians had developed new devices and techniques since his previous marriages, but they had also determined that more aggressive methods would be necessary to overcome the anatomical obstacles to conception. Josepha was essentially subjected to a medieval form of sexual assault disguised as medical treatment. Josepha's letters to her family in Saxony describe experiences that would be classified as torture by modern standards. Ferdinand's physicians had developed a system of restraints that immobilized her during attempted intercourse, supposedly to prevent injury, but actually to enable Ferdinand's complete domination of her body. She wrote that she felt like an animal being bred for slaughter, with no regard for her comfort, dignity, or humanity. The psychological manipulation was as systematic as the physical abuse. Ferdinand isolated Josepha from her Saxon attendants, surrounding her instead with Spanish courtiers who were loyal to him and would report any signs of resistance or depression. He controlled her diet, her schedule, and her social contacts, creating a prison disguised as royal luxury. Ferdinand's treatment of Josepha revealed new depths of cruelty and psychological sophistication. He had learned from his previous marriages that broken women were less likely to resist his demands, so he systematically worked to destroy Josepha's spirit and self-worth. He would praise her beauty one day and criticize her appearance the next, keeping her constantly off balance and desperate for his approval. The king also used Josepha's religious faith as a tool of manipulation. He convinced her that submitting to his sexual demands was her divine duty as a queen, and that resistance to his will was tantamount to rebellion against God. Ferdinand twisted Catholic doctrine to justify his abuse, creating a theological prison that trapped Josepha even when she was alone. Josepha's health deteriorated rapidly under the constant stress of sexual trauma and psychological manipulation. Court physicians documented symptoms that modern medicine would recognize as chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, including insomnia, depression, eating disorders, and frequent episodes of what they called hysteria, but which were clearly panic attacks. The young queen began exhibiting self-destructive behaviors, including deliberate starvation and self-harm. Court ladies reported finding her with scratches and cuts on her arms and legs, apparently inflicted to distract from the psychological pain of her marriage. Ferdinand responded to these signs of distress not with compassion, but with increased surveillance and control. Ferdinand's physicians documented their efforts to keep Josepha healthy enough to fulfill her reproductive duties, but their treatments were focused entirely on maintaining her physical ability to withstand sexual assault, rather than addressing her emotional suffering. They prescribed drugs to calm her resistance and increase her compliance, essentially keeping her in a drugged stupor during intimate encounters. The most disturbing aspect of Josepha's ordeal was its duration. Unlike Ferdinand's previous wives, who died relatively quickly, Josepha survived nearly 10 years of marriage to the monster king. Her endurance may have been due to her youth and strength, but it also meant that she suffered longer than any of Ferdinand's other victims. Josepha never conceived during their marriage, despite Ferdinand's increasingly desperate and violent efforts. Court records suggest that the physical trauma of their sexual encounters had caused so much internal damage that pregnancy became impossible. Ferdinand's reaction to this failure was to blame Josepha and increase the intensity of his efforts, creating a vicious cycle of abuse and medical intervention. The circumstances of Josepha's death in 1829 remain suspicious. She died suddenly of what was officially recorded as fever, but several court observers noted that she had been in good health just days before her collapse. Some historians suggest that Josepha may have finally found the courage to poison herself, rather than endure another decade of Ferdinand's abuse. Ferdinand's response to Josepha's death demonstrated that he had learned nothing from the pattern of tragedy that surrounded his marriages. Rather than reflecting on his role in destroying 3 young women, he immediately began preparations for his fourth marriage. His only concern was that he was now 45 years old and still had no heir, making the production of offspring increasingly urgent. The king's approach to finding his fourth wife showed how his sexual predation had evolved into a calculated system. He instructed his ministers to find a woman who had already proven her fertility through previous childbirth, reasoning that this would increase his chances of finally producing an heir. The psychological and physical well-being of his potential bride was never considered. Ferdinand's choice fell on his niece Maria Christina of the Two Sicilies, who was only 23 when they married in 1829, but had already given birth during a previous relationship. Christina was different from Ferdinand's earlier wives because she had some knowledge of sexuality and childbirth, but this experience only made her more aware of how abnormal and dangerous Ferdinand's behavior was. Christina's marriage to Ferdinand marked a turning point in Spanish history, not because the king had reformed his behavior, but because she proved more resilient and politically astute than his previous victims. Christina survived Ferdinand's sexual demands long enough to bear 2 daughters, including the future Isabella II, whose birth would transform the succession crisis that had been building throughout Ferdinand's reign. The devices and techniques that physicians had developed to enable Ferdinand's sexual function had finally reached a level of sophistication that allowed successful conception, though the process remained traumatic for Christina. Court records describe the use of specialized cushions, restraining apparatus, and positioning devices that enabled penetration while minimizing the risk of severe injury. Christina's pregnancy with Isabella in 1830 created a succession crisis that would ultimately lead to civil war. Spain operated under Salic law, which prevented women from inheriting the throne, meaning that Ferdinand's brother Carlos was the legal heir. However, Ferdinand had become so desperate for any heir that he was willing to change the fundamental laws of succession to allow his daughter to inherit. The Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, which revoked the Salic law and allowed female succession, was Ferdinand's final act of betrayal against the Spanish political system. He had already destroyed the Constitution of 1812 and persecuted liberal reformers, and now he was rewriting the laws of royal succession to benefit his own family. This decision would plunge Spain into the Carlist Wars that would rage for decades after his death. Ferdinand's willingness to change the succession laws revealed the true extent of his narcissism and disregard for Spanish stability. Rather than accept that his anatomical deformities had prevented him from producing a male heir, he chose to reshape the entire political system around his personal failures. The consequences of this decision would affect Spain for generations. Christina's success in bearing Ferdinand an heir also had the perverse effect of encouraging his worst behaviors. Court observers noted that he became even more sexually demanding after Isabella's birth, convinced that he could now produce a male heir with sufficient effort. Christina endured renewed assaults as Ferdinand attempted to force another pregnancy, hoping for a son who would resolve the succession crisis. Ferdinand's final years were marked by declining health and increasing desperation as he realized that his anatomical peculiarities and advancing age made another pregnancy unlikely. His physicians documented symptoms of what modern medicine would recognize as severe erectile dysfunction and possible cardiovascular disease related to his obesity and unhealthy lifestyle. The king's political paranoia also reached new heights during his final period. He surrounded himself with spies and informants, convinced that liberal conspirators were plotting against him and that his own family members were planning to usurp his authority. Ferdinand trusted no one completely, not even Christina, whom he suspected of corresponding with political enemies. Ferdinand's death on September 29, 1833, came as Spanish society was already fragmenting under the pressure of his failed policies and dynastic manipulations. The king died knowing that his legacy would be civil war and political chaos, but his final words reportedly expressed satisfaction that he had maintained absolute power until the end. The immediate aftermath of Ferdinand's death validated every prediction about the catastrophic consequences of his reign. Carlos immediately declared himself the legitimate king, refusing to recognize Isabella's right to inherit under the revised succession laws. The country split between Carlists, who supported traditional male succession, and Cristinos, who backed Isabella and her mother as regent. The First Carlist War, which began within months of Ferdinand's death, was fought with exceptional brutality as both sides sought to eliminate their opponents completely. Tens of thousands of Spaniards died in battles that could be traced directly to Ferdinand's decision to prioritize his personal legacy over political stability. Ferdinand's sexual perversions and anatomical abnormalities had literally reshaped the map of Europe. His inability to produce a male heir through normal means led him to change fundamental laws that had governed Spanish succession for centuries. The resulting civil war destroyed Spain's remaining international influence and completed the collapse of the Spanish Empire that had begun with the loss of American colonies. But Ferdinand's legacy extended beyond immediate political consequences to create cultural and social divisions that persisted well into the modern era. His systematic betrayal of liberal ideals and constitutionalism had poisoned Spanish politics, creating a tradition of authoritarian rule and political violence that would culminate in the Franco dictatorship over a century later. The pattern of sexual abuse and marital violence that characterized Ferdinand's personal life also reflected broader attitudes about women and power that influenced Spanish society for generations. Ferdinand's treatment of his wives as disposable objects whose suffering was irrelevant to state purposes helped establish cultural norms that devalued women's rights and well-being. Modern historians have begun to recognize Ferdinand VII as one of the most destructive monarchs in European history, not just because of his political failures, but because of the personal depravity that drove his public choices. His combination of physical abnormality, moral corruption, and political incompetence created a perfect storm of dysfunction that destroyed Spain's position as a major European power. The medical records and court documents that survive from Ferdinand's reign provide unprecedented insight into how personal pathology can shape historical events. Ferdinand's anatomical deformities were not merely private embarrassments, but driving forces behind political decisions that affected millions of lives. His desperate efforts to overcome his physical limitations led directly to constitutional crises, civil wars, and imperial collapse. Contemporary Spanish historians have also begun to examine how Ferdinand's legacy influenced the political culture that enabled later authoritarian movements. The tradition of absolute rule, systematic repression, and disregard for constitutional limits that Ferdinand established provided a template for future dictators who claimed to restore Spanish greatness, while actually perpetuating the cycle of dysfunction he had created. Ferdinand VII died as he had lived, as a monster whose personal perversions had infected every aspect of Spanish society. His 4 marriages had resulted in 3 deaths and 1 traumatized survivor. His political career had destroyed Spanish democracy and set the stage for decades of civil war. His anatomical abnormalities had forced changes to fundamental laws that would destabilize the country for generations. But perhaps Ferdinand's greatest perversion was his complete inability to learn from the consequences of his actions. Each dead wife should have prompted reflection about his behavior. Each political crisis should have encouraged moderation and compromise. Each military defeat should have suggested new approaches to governance. Instead, Ferdinand responded to every failure by becoming more extreme, more violent, and more determined to impose his will, regardless of the cost. The story of Ferdinand VII serves as a warning about the dangers of concentrated power in the hands of individuals who lack both moral constraints and basic human empathy. His anatomical deformities might have been tragic if they had been accompanied by wisdom and compassion. Instead, they became weapons that he used to torture and destroy everyone who came within his reach. Ferdinand's reign demonstrates how personal pathology can amplify political dysfunction to create catastrophic historical consequences. His physical abnormalities interacted with his moral defects to produce decisions that affected not just Spain, but the entire European balance of power. The man who was literally the biggest dick in Spanish history also proved to be figuratively the most destructive force in the country's development. As we reach the end of this journey through one of history's most disturbing royal reigns, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that Ferdinand VII's legacy continues to influence Spanish politics and society today. The authoritarian traditions he established, the constitutional precedents he set, and the cultural attitudes he reinforced about power and sexuality have echoes in modern Spanish political movements. The most important lesson from Ferdinand VII's life is that power without accountability inevitably corrupts, and that personal dysfunction in leaders can have consequences far beyond their immediate circle. Ferdinand's sexual perversions and anatomical abnormalities were private matters that became public catastrophes because he possessed the authority to impose his pathology on an entire nation. Ferdinand VII stands as perhaps the most literally and figuratively perverted king in European history, a man whose personal deformities and moral corruption combined to destroy one of Europe's great powers. His story reminds us that the most dangerous tyrants are often those who use their private pain and dysfunction as justification for inflicting suffering on others. If this exploration into the darkest corners of royal degeneracy has revealed truths you never imagined, subscribe to continue uncovering the buried secrets that shaped our world. The intersection of personal pathology and political power has produced countless monsters throughout history, and their stories deserve to be told with unflinching honesty. Ferdinand VII's reign of terror ended in 1833, but the scars he left on Spanish society and European politics continue to influence our world today. Understanding how one man's anatomical abnormalities and moral perversions can reshape the fate of nations is essential to recognizing and preventing similar catastrophes in our own time. History's most depraved rulers often hide their personal dysfunction behind claims of divine right and political necessity. Ferdinand VII's legacy teaches us to examine the private pathologies that drive public policies, because the most dangerous monsters are those who convince others that their perversions serve a greater good.